Happy Valentine's Day. I'm Ann Corby. I'm a Kennebunkport resident, and I'm a big fan of Graves Library. And today I'm going to read a love story for Valentine's Day. I'm going to read a story by Alice Adams, who wrote short stories and novels in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. She died, I believe, in the late 1990s. She's an O. Henry Award winner and grew up in North Carolina, went to Radcliffe College, and then moved to California, where she pursued her writing career and taught at Stanford, Berkeley, and I think USC Davis, a lot of the California schools, prolific short story writer. And she's written several novels as well. But you'll find her short story collections in libraries and bookstores. And I took the story that I'm going to read today from a collection of short stories, short love stories, called Love in Full Bloom, edited by Margaret Fowler and Priscilla McCutcheon, and it is, the publisher is Bantam. And we thank them for letting us read this story together today. The story is titled The Girl Across the Room by Alice Adams. Yvonne Soulis, the art historian, is much more beautiful in her late 60s than she was when she was young. And this is strange because she had much trouble in her life, including pancreatic cancer, through which she lived when no one expected her to. Neither her doctor nor her husband, Matthew Van, the musicologist, manufacturer, thought she would make it. Such a small, thin woman. Make it she did, however, although she lost much of her hair in the process of treatment. Now, seated with Matthew on the porch of an inn on the northern California coast, her fine, precise features framed in skillfully arranged, false white waves, she is a lovely woman. In the cool spring night, she is wearing soft, pale woolen clothes, a shawl, and Italian boots, daintily stitched. Matthew Van is also a handsome person, with silky white hair and impressive dark eyes, and he too wears elegant clothes. His posture is distinguished. Yvonne has never taken his name, not for feminist reasons, but because she thinks the combination is unaesthetic. Yvonne Van? Matthew looks and is considerably more fragile than Yvonne, although they are about the same age, that is to say, among other things, of an age to wonder which of them will outlive the other. The question is impossible, inadmissible, and crucially important. Matthew is frailer, but then Yvonne's illness could recur at any time. They have been married for a little over 30 years, and they live these days in San Francisco, having decided that the rigors of New England winters and the overstimulation of Cambridge social life were, in combination, far too much for them. Trips to Europe also, formerly a source of much pleasure, now seem really more strenuous than fun. And so Yvonne and Matthew have taken to exploring certain areas of California, beginning with the near at hand, Yosemite, Lake Tahoe, and now this extraordinarily beautiful stretch of coast, Mendocino, where rivers empty into the sea between sheer cliffs of rock. They are sitting at the far end of the white-railed porch that runs the length of the building in which they are lodging. They have had an early dinner, hoping for quiet, and they are tired from a day of exploring the town and the meadows high above the vibrating sea. The other guests are almost all golfing people, since there is a course adjacent to the inn. They are people in late middle age, a little younger than Yvonne and Matthew, mostly overweight, tending to noise and heavy smoking and excessive drink. not pleasant dinner companions. And Yvonne and Matthew were successful. They finished a quiet dinner of excellent abalone before the boisterous arrival of the golfing group. There was only one other couple in the dining room. That other couple had also been distinctly not a part of the golfing group. And they were as striking in their own way as Yvonne and Matthew were in theirs. Yvonne had been unable not to stare at them, the girl so young and perfectly controlled in all her gestures, the man much older than the girl, so clearly and happily in love with her. It won't end well, Yvonne had thought. Everything is fine as they sit now on the porch. This place to which they have come is very beautiful. The walks through wildflowers and the views back to the river mouth, the beaches, the opposite banks of green are all marvelous. Everything is fine, except for a nagging area of trouble that has just lodged itself somewhere near Yvonne's heart. But the trouble is quite irrational, and she is an eminently sensible woman, and so she pushes it aside and begins a conversation with Matthew about something else. "A thing that I like about being old," she observes to him, at the same time as she reflects that many of their conversations have had just this beginning, "is that you go on trips for their own sake, just to see something, not expecting the trip to change your life. Not hoping that the man you are with will want to marry you," she is thinking to herself, "or that Italy will cure your husband of a girl." "Yes," drawls Matthew in his vague New Hampshire way, but he is a good listener. He very much enjoys her conversation. "Yvonne is the least boring person in the world," he has often said, if not to her, to a great many other people. "When you're young, you really don't see much beyond yourself," Yvonne muses. Then, perhaps as having spoken the word young, thinking of young people, of herself much younger, the trouble increases. It becomes an active, heavy pressure on her heart, so that she closes her eyes for a moment. Then she opens them, facing it, admitting to herself, "That girl in the dining room reminded me of Susanna in Cambridge almost 30 years ago. Not long after we were married, which of course made it worse." What happened was this. In the late 40s in Cambridge, Yvonne was viewed as a smart, attractive, but not really pretty French woman. A widow? Divorced? No one knew for sure. She had heavy dark hair, a husky voice, and a way of starting sentences with an ah that sounded like a tiny bark. Some people were surprised to find her married to Matthew Van, a glamorous man, admired for having fought in Spain, as well as for his great good looks, a man as distinguished as he was rich. Then a beautiful young Radcliffe girl who wanted to become a dancer, and for all anyone knew, eventually became one, a golden California girl, Susanna, fell in love with Matthew, and he with her. But Yvonne wouldn't let him go, and so nothing came of it. That was all. Thus went the story that circulated like a lively winter germ through the areas of Cambridge, adjacent to Harvard Square, up and down Brattle Street, Linnean, Garden Street, and Massachusetts Avenue, and finally over to Hillside Place, where Yvonne and Matthew then were living. "You won't believe me, but I think a very young girl has fallen in love with me," Matthew said to Yvonne one night, near the end of their dinner of lapin aux moutarde, a specialty of Yvonne's, which she always thenceforth connected unpleasantly with that night, although she continued to make it from time to time, silly not to, really. Then Matthew laughed, a little awkward, embarrassed. It does seem unlikely. Not at all. Yvonne's tone was light, the words automatic. Her accent was still very French. You are a very handsome man, she said. You might remember her. We met her at the Emerys. Susanna something from California. I've kept seeing her in Widener Library, and now she says she wants to help me with my research. He laughed, more embarrassed yet. Yvonne experienced a wave of fury, which she quickly brought under control, breathing regularly and taking a small sip of wine. Of course she remembered the girl. Long, dark gold hair and sunny, tawny skin. Bad clothes, but not needing good clothes, with that long, lovely neck. A stiff, rather self-conscious dancer's walk. Lovely long hands, beautifully controlled. Anyone would fall in love with her. In those days, while Yvonne did her own work at the Fogg Museum, Matthew was combining supervision of the factory he had inherited in Waltham with the musicologist career that he had chosen. The research he had mentioned was for his book on Boccherini, for which they would later spend a year in Italy. They had married after a wildly passionate affair, during which Yvonne had managed to wrest Matthew away from poor Flossie, his alcoholic first wife, long since dead in Tennessee. And thinking over the problem of Susanna, one thing that Yvonne said silently to her rival, you can't have him. I've already been through too much for Matthew. Also, in her exceptionally clear-headed way, Yvonne knew Matthew in a way that violent love can sometimes preclude. She knew that he would not take Susanna to bed unless he had decided to break with Yvonne, this out of a strong and somewhat aberrant New England sense of honor, and also out of sexual shyness, unusual in so handsome, so sensual a man. Yvonne herself had had to resort to a kind of seduction by force, but a young, proud girl could not know of such tactics. Yvonne was right. Matthew did not have an affair with Susanna. He probably never saw her outside of Widener Library, except for an intense cup of coffee at Hayes Bickford restaurant, where they were noticed together. However, Matthew suffered severely, and that was how Yvonne treated him, like someone with a serious disease. She was affectionate and solicitous, and very slightly distant, as though his illness was something that she didn't want to catch. One March evening, after a bright, harsh day of intermittent sun, rain, and wind, Matthew came home for dinner, a little late, with a look on his face of total and anguished exhaustion. Handing him his gin, they were in the kitchen. She had been tasting her good lamb stew, a Navarin. Van thought, the girl has broken it off, or has given him an ultimatum. Such a mistake. She thought, I hope I won't have to hear about it. All Matthew said during dinner was, the Boccherini project is sort of getting me down. My ideas don't come together. Poor darling, she said carefully, alertly watching his face. I should spend more time at the factory. Well, why don't you? As they settled in the living room for coffee, Yvonne saw that his face had relaxed a little. Perhaps now he would want to talk to her. She said, there's a Fred Astaire revival at the UT tonight. I know you don't like them, but would you mind if I go? Ah, dear, it's almost time. Not saying to him, you unspeakable fool, how dare you put me through all this? Are you really worth it? Alone in the crowded balcony of the University Theater, as on the screen Fred and Ginger sang to each other about how lovely a day it was to be caught in the rain, Yvonne thought for a moment. that she would, after all, go home and tell Matthew to go to his girl Susanna. She would release him with as little guilt as possible, since she was indeed fond of Matthew. Je tiens à Matthew. Tenir, I hold to Matthew, Yvonne thought then. And she also thought, no, it would not work out well at all. Matthew is much too vulnerable for a girl like that. He is better off with me. Of course, she was right, as Matthew himself must have come to realize, and over the summer he seemed to recover from his affliction. Yvonne saw his recovery, but she also understood that she had been seriously wounded by the episode, coming as it did so early in their life together. Afterward, she was able to think more sensibly. Well, much better early than later on, when he could have felt more free. That fall, they left for Italy, where, curiously, neither of them had been before. Yvonne, because her Anglophile parents had always taken her to the Devon coast on holidays, or sometimes to Scotland. Matthew, because with drunken Flossie, any travel was impossible. They settled in a small hotel in Rome, in a large, romantically alcoved room that overlooked the Borghese Gardens. They went on trips north to Orvieto, Todi, Spoleto, Gubbio, south to Salerno, Positano, Ravello. They were dazed, dizzy with pleasure at the landscape, the views of olive orchards, of pines and flowers and stones, the ancient buildings, the paintings and statuary. The food and wine, they shared a mania for pasta. A perfect trip, except that, from time to time, Yvonne was jolted sharply by a thought of that girl, Susanna. And looking at Matthew, she wondered if he too thought of her with sadness, regret. The question hurt. She would have to ask Matthew, and deliberately she chose a moment of pure happiness. They were seated on a vine-covered terrace at Orvieto, across the square from the gorgeously striped cathedral, drinking cool white wine. Having made love early that morning when Yvonne asked, "Do you ever wonder what happened to that girl Susanna?" Genuine puzzlement appeared on Matthew's distinguished face, and then he said, "I almost never think of her. I don't have time." Knowing Matthew, Yvonne was sure that he spoke the truth, and she wryly thought, "I undoubtedly think more often of that girl, that episode, than Matthew does." And so she too stopped thinking of Susanna, or almost, except for an occasional reminder. Leaving Rome, they traveled up to Florence, then Venice, Innsbruck, and Vienna, where Boccherini did, or quite possibly did not, murder his rival Mozart. That was the first of a succession of great trips. Yvonne and Matthew remained, for the most part, very happy with each other, and over the years, their sexual life declined only slightly. Then, in her late 50s, Yvonne became terribly sick. At first, undiagnosably so. Surgery was indicated. On being told the probable nature of her illness, she had insisted on that. Yvonne remarked to her doctor, one of the chief surgeons at Massachusetts General Hospital, "Well, my chances are not exactly marvelous then, are they?" "No, not marvelous," he admitted. After surgery, oppressively drugged, Yvonne was mainly aware of pain, which surged in heavy waves toward her, almost overwhelming her and very gradually receding. She was aware, too, of being handled a great deal, not always gently, of needles inserted in tubes, of strong hands manipulating her small body. Sometimes, half-conscious, she would wonder if she was dreaming. But at least she knew that she was alive. Dead people don't wonder about anything. She was sure of that. The first face that she was aware of was her surgeon's. humorless, stern, seeming always to be saying, no, not marvelous. Then there was the face of a black nurse, kind and sad, a gentle mourning face. At last she saw Matthew, so gaunt and stricken that she knew she had to live. It was that simple. Dying was something she could not do to Matthew. She's got to be the strongest woman I've ever seen, basically, the dubious surgeon remarked later on to Matthew, who by then could beamingly agree. Chemotherapy worked. It took most of her hair, but fortunately did not make her sick. Yvonne very gradually regained strength and some health, and with a great effort, she put back on a few of the many lost pounds. Matthew learned to make a superior fettuccine, and he served it to her often. After her illness and surgery, they did not make love anymore. They just did not. Yvonne missed it in a dim, sad way, but on the other hand, she could sometimes smile at the very idea of such a ludicrous human activity to which she herself had once devoted so much time. She was on the whole amused and a little skeptical of accounts of very sexually active 70 and 80-year-olds. Why did they bother, really? While she was recuperating, Yvonne finished a study of Marie Laurencin that she had been working on for years, and her book had considerable acclaim, even reasonably good sales. Matthew did not finish his Boccherini study, but from time to time he published articles in places like the Yale Review, the Virginia Quarterly Review. A year ago they left Cambridge and moved to the pleasant flat on Green Street in San Francisco. Now on the porch in Mendocino, thinking of the girl across the room at dinner and remembering Susanna, all that pain. Yvonne has a vivid insight as to how it would have been if she had abandoned Matthew to Susanna all those years ago. Matthew would, of course, have married the girl. That is how he is, and they would have been quite happy for a while. He would have gazed dotingly upon her in restaurants, like the man in the dining room with his Susanna, and then somehow it would have all gone bad, and a sad old age for Matthew. The girl bored and irritable, Matthew worn out, not understanding anything. But what of herself? What would have happened to her? The strange part is that Yvonne had never inquired into this before. Now, with perfect logic, she suddenly, jarringly sees just what would have happened. For a while, considerable unhappiness for her, a slow recovery. And then she would have been quite herself again, maybe a little improved. She would have remarried amazing. She could almost see him. He is no one she knows, but a man much younger than herself, very dark. In fact, he is French. They had many intimate things in common. He might be a painter. He is very unlike Matthew. Would she still have had her great illness? She is not sure. Her vision ends with that man, her marriage to him. Something in her expression probably has made Matthew ask a question never asked between them. A question, in fact, for adolescent lovers. What were you thinking just now? And he is given by Yvonne the requisite response. I was thinking, my darling, of you, at least in part. The air on the porch is perceptibly chillier than when they first came out from dinner. Time to go in, and yet they are both reluctant to move. It is so beautiful where they are. In the distance, gray-white lines of foam across the sea, beneath a calm, pale evening sky. Closer to hand are the surrounding, sheltering pines and cypresses. Then, from whatever uncharacteristic moment of strong emotion, Matthew says another thing that he has not said before. I was thinking, he says, that without you, I would not have had much of a life at all. Does he mean if they had never met? Or does he mean if he had left her for that girl, for fair Susanna? Or